Welcome back. Today we're focusing on syncope in the emergency department. It's more than just figuring out faint. It's really a high-stakes, time-critical mission.
Absolutely. It's about preventing sudden cardiac death, ultimately.
So when that patient with transient loss of consciousness arrives, what are the two immediate triage questions we have to answer right off the bat?
Yeah, we're trying to nail down two main things. First, was this syncope or was it a seizure? Getting that right is crucial for the workup.
Okay, syncope versus seizure. What's the second?
Second, was the syncope cardiac or non-cardiac? Because, cardiac syncope carries that high mortality risk. Non-cardiac usually means a safer disposition.
Got it. And to do that efficiently, what are the, let's say, three absolute non-negotiables, the things that must happen every single time?
Right. The foundation is pretty simple, but easily missed if things get chaotic. It's a focused history, a good cardiac physical exam, and an electrocardiogram.
History, physical, ECG.
Exactly. Every syncope workup really starts, and honestly often ends, with just those three: routine labs, imaging. That stuff is secondary.
Efficiency follows safety. Okay, let's jump into that first step. Syncope versus seizure. When we're looking at motor activity, witness reports, what finding has the highest specificity for a tonic-clonic seizure?
You need to ask specifically about the tongue. A lateral tongue bite that has 100% specificity for a tonic-clonic seizure.
100%. That's powerful.
It changes the diagnosis right there.
But what about just a cut tongue? Like, couldn't someone bite the tip of their tongue during a regular faint?
Yeah, exactly. If the bite is just on the tip, you often see that with syncope. But even a simple cut, not strictly lateral, still has a very high specificity, 97%.
97%.
Right, with the likelihood ratio of 17 for seizure. So the location matters, but really any damage beyond the very tip points strongly towards seizure.
Okay, that precision brings us to myoclonic jerks. They can look alarming, and we know, maybe 90% of syncopal episodes have some jerking? How do we tell the difference?
It's about the quantity. Think of it as the 10.20 rule, sort of. Fewer than 10 myoclonic jerks. That strongly suggests syncope.
Okay, less than 10, probably syncope.
But if you're hearing about more than 20 jerks, that amount of motor activity really suggests a seizure. The number is the key here.
Makes sense. Now, flipping that, what historical clue gives strong evidence for syncope? Something that makes us lean away from seizure.
The context. Definitely the context. If the loss of consciousness happened while the patient was sitting or standing for a long time.
Like prolonged standing, yeah.
That points towards a vasovagal or orthostatic cause. That specific history has a 98% specificity, likelihood ratio of 20 for syncope. Very strong.
And conversely, what happens after the event that's almost always seen in seizure patients?
The post-ictal state. Confusion, sleepiness, taking time to get back to baseline. That's seen in about 96% of seizure patients.
So if they snap right back,
then seizure becomes much less likely.
Okay, let's clear up a common misconception. What historical marker should we absolutely not rely on to distinguish the two?
Urinary incontinence.
Right. Heard that one a lot.
Yeah, but it just can't reliably separate them. It have a likelihood ratio of 6.7, which sounds okay, but it's just not definitive enough when you're dealing with two very different underlying problems. It's a pitfall.
Good to clarify. Let's move to step 2 then. Identifying those high-risk cardiac causes. This is where the mortality risk really is. What are the 3 highest risk historical factors? The lead flags.
Okay, 3 big ones. First, syncope that happens suddenly, absolutely no warning, no prodrome.
Just lights out.
Exactly. Second, syncope that happens specifically during exertion, lifting weights, running, that kind of thing.
Right.
And third, a prodrome, if there is one, that includes serious symptoms, like palpitations that has a likelihood ratio of 8.3, or shortness of breath, even higher in 13, or chest pain.
Suggest underlying structural or electrical issues.
Precisely.
Speaking of structure, what 2 specific structural heart diseases require extreme caution?
Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or HCM, and critical aortic stenosis. Those are non-negotiable red flags. Need a thorough investigation.
So why is listening carefully to the chest, the auscultation, so critical, even if the history seems straightforward?
Because of older patients with critical aortic stenosis, and critical means the valve diameter is less than 1 centimeter.
That's tight.
Very tight. And if that patient presents with syncope, the prognosis is terrible, very high mortality. You have to listen for that murmur. Missing it is missing a potentially fatal diagnosis.
Okay. And expanding the screen, what about family history? What findings should trigger a deeper cardiac workup, maybe thinking about channelopathies?
Well, obviously, unexplained sudden death in relatives, But also look for less obvious things like unexplained drowning or a single-person car crash, especially that relative was under 50.
Interesting. Drowning or a single MVA?
Yeah, those could suggest an underlying primary electrical issue like a channelopathy manifesting as sudden death.
That brings us to maybe rarer causes. What about a patient with recurrent syncope, specifically after activities involving neck extension, like yoga or looking up high?
That specific pattern should make you think about Eagle's syndrome.
Eagle's syndrome.
Okay, it involves a calcified, elongated stylohyoid ligament pressing on the carotid artery, causes temporary hypoperfusion. It's rare, sure, but you need a computed tomography scan to diagnose it, not the usual cardiac workup.
Good point. History and physical are paramount, leading us right into step 3, diagnostics.
All right.
If you could only pick one test in the ED for syncope, what is it?
The electrocardiogram, full stop. It's the single most important test.
The ECG.
For many discrete syncope cases, it might honestly be the only test you need. And always look at the rhythm strip from EMS if you have it.
Oh, good reminder. The pre-hospital strip.
Yeah, that initial rhythm might show something that's resolved by the time they get to you.
Okay, ECG is central. What 3 basic intervals on that ECG cover most of the high-risk conditions we're worried about?
You want to scrutinize the PR interval, the QRS interval, and the QT interval. That covers your conduction delays, accessory pathways, repolarization issues. Got it. PR, QRS, QT. Let's hit some high-yield pathologies. What ECG findings suggest hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that #1 cause of sudden death in young athletes? You look for voltage criteria for left ventricular hypertrophy, sure, but even more specific are those narrow, deep, sometimes dagger-like Q waves.
Dagger Qs. Where?
Usually in the inferior and lateral leads.
Hmm.
Leads 2, 3, AVF, V5, V6.
Okay. And what about Brugada syndrome? That carries, what, a 10% chance of death in the next year if missed? What's the pattern?
Yeah, that's a scary one. The
That's
classic
scary.
sign is that downsloping ST elevation in leads V1 or V2, the type 1 pattern.
Downsloping ST elevation, V1, V2.
Clinicians have to recognize it. Sometimes it only shows up when the patient has a fever, so you need to be vigilant.
Right. What about conduction delays? If we see existing blocks, what combination suggests a high risk of progressing to a 3rd-degree block, needing a pacemaker?
The combination to watch for is a bifascicular block, like a right bundle branch block, plus a left anterior or posterior fascicular block, especially if it's combined with a 1st-degree AV block.
Bifascicular plus 1st-degree.
Yeah, that suggests pretty significant disease in the conduction system. It could progress quickly to complete heart block.
Okay, let's talk about appropriate testing beyond the ECG troponin. Should we order it routinely on syncope patients?
No, absolutely not routinely. Troponin should really only be for patients where you specifically suspect acute coronary syndrome.
So if they have chest pain or equivalent symptom?
Exactly. Chest pain, discomfort, maybe shortness of breath that sounds ischemic. Don't just add it on to every faint. Too many false positives, unnecessary cost.
And similarly, what about working up pulmonary embolism routinely? Syncope is sometimes listed as a symptom.
Again, no. Routine D-dimer testing for syncope isn't appropriate. There was a large North American study, Perspective, showed a PE prevalence of only 0.6% in syncope patients.
0.6%. Very low.
Very low yield. So unless other symptoms or risk factors strongly suggest PE, don't chase it routinely in syncope. Be selective.
Okay. Leads us to the final phase. Step 4, disposition and clinical judgment.
Right. The what next?
Does calling it presyncope, feeling like you're going to faint but not quite losing consciousness, let us risk stratify lower, especially in older adults?
That's a dangerous assumption. Older patients presenting with presyncope actually have comparable 1-month risks for major adverse cardiac events as those with full syncope.
Same risk. Wow.
Pretty much the same risk. You have to treat presyncope in the elderly with the same seriousness as completed syncope. No downplaying it.
Good point. How do clinical decision tools like the San Francisco syncope rule stack up against just good old clinical judgment, physician gestalt?
Well, the tools can be helpful adjuncts, maybe prompt your thinking, but they have limitations, especially with external validation. They don't replace the clinician.
So trust your gut based on the assessment.
Exactly. Expert opinion really supports using physician gestalts based on that focused history, the physical, the ECG, to identify those truly low-risk patients, safe for discharge. Clinical skills still wins here.
Okay. For those low-risk patients we do send home, but maybe there's still a nagging doubt, like an unclear family history, what's the best outpatient diagnostic approach?
They definitely need outpatient cardiology follow-up. And if you're trying to catch a rare intermittent arrhythmia, external loop recorders generally offer a higher diagnostic yield than a standard Holter monitor.
Because they monitor for longer.
Exactly. Longer duration means a better chance of capturing that infrequent event.
Makes sense. We've spent almost all our time on the heart, understandably. But let's finish with the brain. To cause true syncope, how must a central nervous system lesion present?
Yeah, it's a key distinction. For a CNS lesion to cause true syncope, that transient loss of consciousness from global brain hypoperfusion, it has to be extensive.
How extensive?
It needs to directly affect either both cerebral hemispheres simultaneously or the brainstem itself. That's what interrupts consciousness globally.
So if someone has focal neurological signs after the event,
Then it probably wasn't true syncope. It was more likely a transient ischemic attack or a stroke involving a specific area. That distinction is vital when you're deciding about, say, head imaging versus further cardiac workup, global versus focal deficit.
a critical distinction. Okay, so the final thought for everyone listening. If your history, physical exam, and a perfect ECG are all reassuring, but that patient is still convinced something is terribly wrong with their heart, how do you balance patient concerns, safety, and resource stewardship in that ED setting? Something to think about. We're out of time for today. Stay safe out there.